Hello, this is your host, Mark Delcom, and welcome to Divine and Diverse, a podcast spotlighting queer voices and our allies who have reclaimed their divinity after religious abuse. Our sacred space fosters transformative conversations on faith, identity, and resilience, where our guests share stories of struggle and triumph, offering hope to those on similar paths. Hello, this is Mark. On this episode of Divine and Diverse, my guest is Sean Hayden, actor, attorney, and host of the hit podcast series Stage Combat, the podcast. Sean and I have a deeply personal conversation about what happened to him on stage while performing, his resulting mental crisis, and how Sean has taken that experience to speak out about the troubling side of the theater industry to bring awareness and support for the mental well-being of theater workers and promoting safe working practices. Also, during our conversation, we discussed the impact of religion on performers, Sean's own personal experience growing up in a Southern Baptist church as a young gay person, and how some roles may trigger past religious trauma and abuse. Now on to our conversation with Sean. All right. Hello, Sean. How are you?
Hey, Mark. How you doing today?
I am awesome. I am freaking awesome, as I usually say. And there's truth to that. It's not just something that I like to say. I'm in a good space these days for a lot of reasons. And I'm really glad that you're joining us today. We're going to talk about a few different things that so we've gotten to know each other recently. And I'm fascinated by what you're doing with the podcast. So for our listeners who don't know anything about Stage Combat, the podcast, why don't you tell us a little bit about it, first of all?
Yeah. Well, Stage Combat, the podcast started a year ago. I experienced a mental health crisis in middle age, Mark. I was working as an actor at one of the most powerful theaters in the country, and I didn't feel safe in my job. And my body just collapsed. I literally collapsed during a live performance of a show on stage and had to be dragged off. And so, and that started a 3.5-year mental health journey that I never expected to have. I developed a panic disorder, panic attacks. So coming out of that journey, I got the idea of, because a lot of people would say things like, oh, I didn't think something like that would happen to you, because we have such a stigma about mental health, particularly when it comes from guys. I've always considered myself sort of an alpha male, whatever that is, that horrible term, right? But, in terms, I take charge kind of guy, not the toxic guy.
Sure.
So I thought, well, let me show you how it happens. Let me show you moment by moment how it happens. So I got this idea to create a podcast to tell the story of what happened at my job and my mental health journey, but to tell it like a true crime podcast.
Yeah, right.
So we did that in 2 seasons, over 20 episodes, with voice actors and production and sound effects and music. Very immersive experience. And then we had health professionals come in after the story part, like the halftime show at a football game, to tell you what you just heard and talk about it. Start a real conversation. Wow. So that's how the podcast started. And then this new season 3, we're telling other people's stories. So a lot of people wrote in a message after hearing my story and say, this happened to me too, or I had panic attacks, or I didn't feel safe in my job, or, I had a mental health crisis and I didn't feel like anyone saw me or heard me. And so that's what this new season is all about, which has been really rewarding to launch.
What a journey, right? And so let's go back to when you had this happen to you. You didn't expect this at all. Like you said, you were performing on stage and just boom, it just happened.
Yeah.
And for you to look back on this, did you ever find out what triggered that moment?
I know exactly what triggered it. Yeah.
What?
It was the feeling of that I didn't feel safe in my job, and the awareness that my employer was not providing me with a safe work environment, all while I was required to play a very emotional role as we do as actors. So, we're required to, I had a role where I had to cry twice a show, 8 times a week. That's 16 cries.
Oh my God.
We're very vulnerable as a population just by virtue of what our skill set is and what our job requires us to do. So when you combine that with the fear that you're losing control or you're not being protected, it creates the perfect storm. And it's really a conversation we haven't had enough of about performing artists and, just providing a safe environment from a mental health standpoint, considering our very tools, they're our emotions. That's our toolkit, you know.
You mentioned that, and you said that twice, that you didn't feel safe. And of course, I'm not being an actor, not being in that situation. I didn't connect to that because I'm thinking, well, being safe in my workspace is going to be a much different experience. I'm going to take it like, well, I feel like my job is safe. I'm supported by my leader. I'm supported by my organization, a leader
Yeah.
myself. I think I take care of my team. I know that I'm there in a servant leadership mode, meaning that my job is really to make sure that they're successful in their jobs, right? And I work in an organization that has a healthy culture like that. And you're right. So when you said that you didn't feel safe and being in a circumstance where you have to open yourself up, and I am a lover of the arts, I have honestly never thought of what that's like for you to go through that in that moment. And it's easy to think, well, that's just acting.
Mm-hmm.
And that you're actually detached from your own, like it's almost like an out of body experience that you've transformed into that character. And in your case, you left Sean behind. Sean is, just the carriage of that moment. And to what you're saying, that's not true. Obviously, there's still, you're entwined. It's you doing this,
Yeah.
and especially for a vulnerable role.
Yeah. I would say as actors, I don't know if we're detached. It's like, we're skilled to do it, but we a good definition of acting is, living truthfully under imaginary circumstances,
Mm,
but we bring ourselves to that. So just
mm,
that example I said,
yeah,
where the character I played, I had to cry 16 times a week. Can you
yeah.
imagine if you or anyone listening cried 16 times in 1 week? What does your
No, I
body
can't
feel
imagine.
like? Yeah, there's a
Right.
there's a there's a physical and an emotional toll to that, and the employers in my industry, they haven't recognized that. And just like you were saying, in your profession, what can you do to support and uplift the people around you?
Yeah.
There
Yeah.
hasn't been enough of that, or even a conversation about that in my profession.
So are you hopeful that is this one of the goals of the podcast
Absolutely.
itself? Is
Yeah.
that you break through
Yeah.
to the producers and to the others that are the decision makers within the performing arts industry, say, we have to take care of our folks. And this is one way
Absolutely.
in which to do this. Wow. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
I
Wow.
mean, a big part of our mission at Stage Combat is not just in telling stories so that people feel seen and heard, whether they're
Yeah.
the storyteller or the listener, but
Yeah.
that we're advocates for real change, because the mentality has always been the
Mm.
show must go on. And we're here to say, no, it doesn't, not when it comes at such a human cost. So, we have a lot of people who are producers, stage managers who are listening to the podcast, instructors, academia who are having their students listen to it. But then it's people like you who aren't in the industry that maybe never thought about this. You know, it's a fascinating window into, always when you can get behind the employees only door, that's always fascinating, right? From a
Of
storytelling
course.
standpoint. But I
Right.
think we're
Right.
educating people to think about it. If you buy a ticket to Wicked and you loved and enjoyed that show, but what if we told you stories of how the people backstage were being treated and how they were traumatized? Does that change the way you view that show and your decisions and supporting and purchasing tickets for a production? It's a very important conversation to have.
Absolutely. So as soon as she said that, and I put myself in that seat at Wicked, and of course, or any show that I'm at, and I'm only watching what's being presented to me. I am not thinking what happens backstage, unless you hear a random noise or something that catches your attention. That oh my gosh, that you're a part of this experience.
Yeah.
But it's kind of like breaking the fourth wall. That's something you typically don't do. It is
No,
about
because
what.
you're going to be
Go ahead.
transported, to be entertained,
Exactly.
for the magic, right?
Yes. Wow. So, to your point, would I feel differently, or will I now because of what you just shared with me? Of course. The awareness. I have no choice. It's like the cliche that goes, "I don't know what I don't know, but once I do know, I can't
Yeah.
unknow it." And I never have thought
Yeah.
about, what are the working circumstances for a performing artist in that particular case like that? Because if you don't have a system in place, and you said something else, the show must go on. And so you have
Yes.
the pressures of that, because let's face it, there's money involved. There's huge production cost. You have the responsibility of a production staff that's completely around this. I mean, there's an entire ecosystem that goes with every production.
Yeah.
And if you're a key component of that, whether it's in a small role or title role, you have the weight of that responsibility on you. And that can be crushing, I'm sure.
Yeah. I can assure you, if you or any of your listeners listen to the first episode of this new season, you will think differently about Wicked, the production. We tell the
Okay.
stories of one particular actor, and it was so bad it caused him to leave the industry. So, we have harmful behavior that's crushing people in a way that they just don't want to produce their art anymore, and they're leaving the profession. And outside of just the physical and mental health costs on that person, but the idea that we're just quashing someone's desire to create is really heartbreaking to me.
Absolutely. Because we all know how much effort one must take to get themselves to this point. And then we're not just talking about Broadway or off Broadway or off Broadway. It could be a regional production, whatever it might be.
Oh yeah,
It is
my story took place in a regional production. Yeah.
Right. It doesn't have to be in that huge title role. And you were, and so, and exactly that, you still are committed to this. You're putting your soul into your craft there.
Yeah.
Wow. So definitely, I look forward to this journey on season 3. And just going backward as well, but also what you're doing. Because let's go back. You did say that you're now interviewing and having conversations with, in the episodes with folks that you heard from and setting those scenarios. So tell us a little bit more about that. Who are these individuals that you were hearing from that are that you're using for episode 3?
Well, they're performing artists from all walks of life. They're Broadway
Yeah.
stars. They're people who work in community theater. They're people in small regional theater. So, that's the great thing is, an artist is an artist, and an artist, no matter what level of theater they're performing, deserves a safe working space, and so that's what we really try to emphasize. But what we did with this new season was, these stories came in, and I literally old school printed off the stories and messages that we got, and we cataloged them by subject matter in a notebook. And so each episode is on a certain topic, a certain scenario. Like our first 2 episodes were about toxic stage managers on Broadway. Our third episode is a tragic case of an actor who, trigger warning here, for self-harm, but felt like he was so bullied in a production of Chicago on Broadway that he took his life. We felt like people have forgotten his story. So we retold his story so that, again, so people would understand what he was going through. But, then we also look at issues such as fight safety. Stage combat, the name stage combat came out of, I was involved in stage combat sequences on stage at this regional theater where I didn't feel safe. So we're looking at that on Broadway, and a bunch of other issues when it comes to bullying, when it comes to harassment, when actors are asked to portray sexual or intimate content on stage in an unsafe manner, and then also some inspirational stories. We're looking at, what are young artists just coming out of conservatory or theater programs? What are they concerned about? What do they want for the future? I want a better life for them than I saw 25 years in the industry. So it's really an exciting season to elevate these stories, so that stage combat has really become a community and not just Sean telling his story of what happened at this regional theater.
That's beautiful work you're doing. I like how you mentioned also the younger generations who they seem to be a little different than our generations.
They're very
I'm a few
different.
years old.
Yeah.
Aren't they though? And it's exciting
way.
and invigorating. And it's in a good way.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I can relate to that because, we're doing this conversation as part of Divine and Diverse, which is a part of Divine All Along Foundation, the project that I founded, and it's to a simple mission to end religious abuse for our queer family. And that's what started this conversation that you and we're going to get into that. But one of the things that reminds me with another person who I interviewed for Divine and Diverse, he was a Nazarene pastor who, since the recording, actually has left his congregation. And it was obviously he had issue with the anti-queer attitude of that particular denomination. But what the breaking point for him was actually his 14-year-old daughter. She loves her father. She understood his vocation, but she told him very point blank, I will not bring my friends into church where you are preaching, not because I don't love you and you don't love her friends, which he did, but it was the message that he had to carry in behalf of the denomination that he represented, and that was his breaking point. He said, I cannot be a part of something where my child says it's not safe for me to bring my friends in there and show them what is basically hatred or the abuse. And abuse comes across in multitudes of ways. And to that point, it is the Zillennials and the Gen Zs that something happened that they simply choose not to participate in this, and they're saying we will not do this. And so me being I'm on the cusp of a baby boomer Gen Xer at 60. I'd like to think I get that, but I was a part of that abuse and probably perpetrated it on my own part. I didn't have those boundaries, and did you have those boundaries when you were growing up?
In terms of
like knowing what was right and what was wrong, or how far can you be pushed, and then I'm asking you, not only as younger, but as you were getting into the creative arts field, like I'm sure you experienced bullying and everything else, right? That was part of the culture.
Look, in terms of the industry, it was very much, as I still think it is very much, it's like it's ingrained in you that you don't speak up. If you speak up, you won't be hired. If you speak up, you're deemed to be a troublemaker rather than someone who's trying to call out a harmful practice so other people aren't harmed, or just trying to speak up for themselves. So that's been, an epidemic throughout the industry since it existed, and I think you are right. The younger generation is not willing to accept that as the status quo, because through their social media, they do openly talk about mental health. They do openly talk about boundaries, so that's just what they're used to. That conversation is what they're used to. We have a episode coming up. It's two people, not necessarily telling about a harmful practice, but they created their own one-man shows to create the one-person shows to tell their own mental health story. And the conversation kept coming up about the stigma and breaking the stigma. And both of these actors are like 40 plus. We gave it to someone in their 20s to listen to just to get their feedback. And he said, I thought it was interesting that all of you talked about breaking the stigma because you're older. And he said, not to say that you're old, Sean, but I am older than he says, but you're older than me. He says, I don't feel like there's a stigma. I don't feel like, he says, between me and my friends, we don't think twice about talking about mental health. And I'm not saying that's true for everyone, but I think there is that sort of a different take on mental health for people who are in their 20s, early 30s than people of the next generation.
Yeah. So is this a question, you mentioned it before, but who is the audience for this? Is it a certain category? Is it the producers? Is it folks who need to hear the message?
Well, yes, and yes. Look, I think the most immediate audience are performing artists and crew members who, have gone through their own trauma or just have not felt seen or heard. I definitely feel like every theater director, producer should listen to the podcast, and we know they are listening to the podcast because they probably don't want to be another, I won't say the name, but the Connecticut theater that I told a story about for two seasons, And I think the third audience market, it's people who are just curious about the entertainment industry,
Yeah.
and like I said before, are intrigued by that going behind the employees only door. But they are concerned. We have so many people say, I look at shows differently now, like we were talking about before, whereas I never did before. These are just people who are just concerned about, no matter what field of work, that people are treated humanely and that they have safe workspaces. That's universal.
It is universal. That is exactly right. And trauma is trauma. Abuse is abuse. It doesn't matter how it happens. It's wrong.
Yeah.
And you happen to be a part of an industry where obviously it's been taking place. And then for people like me that are sitting in the seat, not on the stage or behind the stage or around the stage, again, we're going to be ignorant to those kinds of issues, but you're enlightening
Yeah.
us. And I thank you for that.
And we have a real challenge because I think there is a sentiment that, acting is glamorous. The saying we always hear, you're lucky to have this job. And it negates the fact that they are jobs. It also negates how hard we work and how hard it is to get a job. But the fact is, at the end of the day, a job is a job is a job. And no matter what that job is, no matter if you work in an office or a factory, or you work at the most prominent regional theater in the country, you're entitled to the same work protections. And the nature of your
Yes.
job may mean that you need additional protections. I think it's interesting, for instance, like sports teams, they have physical therapists, but they also have mental health professionals. We don't have that in our industry, which is something we've really been advocating for. But it needs to be it boggles the mind, right?
Okay, so yes. So the look you saw on my face is, again, I'm fortunate to work for a really good organization. We have an EAS program, Employee Assistance Support Program, which is confidential. There's a telephone number and a website that, again, and I just recently had one of my team members who I referred to it, but they take on that conversation behind a wall of total confidentiality. It can be on any topic. It can be on substance abuse. It can be on family relations. It can be work related, and all of that is covered and protected inside of this. And this is an add-on to our health insurance, but I mean, it has mental health services in there where they can refer back into any of the in-network, psychiatrists or psychologists and therapists in there. But they also have their own. They have a whole host and multitude of things for the well-being of our individuals. And you're saying that does not exist in your industry. There's not like a telephone number you can call.
It does not exist. Now, Mark, if I'm doing a show and I have some problems with my back, there's a physical therapist that's made available that I can go to.
Right.
But if I have collapsed on stage and I don't know what's happening to me, and I get dragged off the stage and I break up tears crying, there's no one to call. Yeah. So it just shows you how backwards the industry is. And, I also serve in the corporate area. I serve on this advisor committee for HR.com. They have a mental health and wellness advisor committee that I serve on. And I can tell you, not across the board, but most of corporate America got the memo after the pandemic. Like there's a lot of good stuff that I hear going on with companies, with benefits, with peer support groups, literacy. That doesn't happen. You will rarely even hear the words mental health mentioned when you go into a production or start a rehearsal for a production.
Just taking a pause to process all this, and
it's a lot. Yeah,
it is, and it's We're going to turn the page on the conversation in a minute, but I am so glad you shared this. It's enlightening, and I hope that our listeners also see the value of your experience and how you are taking something that happened to you and turning it into a way in which to help others and bring awareness to a critically needed service. I can't believe that nobody other than you have to rely on your castmates, I guess, or your family to give you support, that there's no way for the support mechanism to be in place when there's so many, as you just said, so many other companies nowadays. We have those kinds of services through EAS or whatever it might be called.
Well,
so
look,
thank you very much.
That's what we're trying to change with the podcast. We're the little podcast that could, but we're I'm directly having conversations with people within our actors union. We have a proposal of a
Mm.
bunch of changes that can be made. And so I'm hopeful. Look, I know change is slow, but if you don't have hope, what do we have, right? And I'm a firm believer that if we just keep kicking and screaming, eventually we're going to wear the people in power down, because there are far more people of
Yeah,
us at the bottom, which I always say the people with the talent. There are far more of us than there are the people at the top. The people at the
amen,
top just
brother.
have the power. So we're going to keep kicking and screaming and keep elevating this conversation, and eventually change will come. And I think, going back to what we said earlier, Mark, we're going to be assisted by that younger generation because their
Yes,
expectations and their demands are different. And
yeah.
I applaud them and wait for them to make their demands.
Well said, sir. Well said. So, in a earlier conversation we had, Sean.
May I ask you something real quick?
Yeah, of
Um,
course.
because I know you're not going. This is a continuous feed. Let me just see how quickly I can do this.
Yeah, go for it.
I haven't. We had some technical problems on my end at the beginning of this conversation,
Yeah,
but I do need to get a battery plugged into this phone right now.
go for it.
Um, let's see right here. I'm
So,
trying
folks,
to.
welcome to
What do you
Unedited
want to talk to the
Conversations.
listeners while I take care of that?
Absolutely.
Okay.
So while Sean is looking for his a way to plug in, and yes, he's right. Before we started recording, this is the beauty of doing a podcast and conversations. And folks, I personally have a belief that we do not edit conversations. You just let them go for what they are, and you only remove something if you must, and there's no other option. So that's why you're listening to this while Sean fetches a charging cable for his phone. So we're going to bridge the conversation here into something that when Sean and I were talking, while he was looking for a parking space on street parking because he's a New Yorker, Manhattanite like I am, and he does not have a garage. So that means that
I
twice a
won.
week he you were. That's exactly what you're doing. And Sean and I wound up having an amazing conversation that was supposed to be 15 minutes and turned into well over an hour conversation. It's just when you find
It was
somebody
a great
like
conversation.
Sean, it was an awesome conversation because there's the connection and the camaraderie, and there's so much intersection in our respective lives and what our calls are. And that's exactly what I call what your call, Sean. It is that. Now, when people hear that, it was like, well, does that mean it's religious? Well, okay. Calling is a little bit more than just that. Mine is a little bit more, I would say, in the faith, spiritual spaces, divine all along. So here's where I'm going to go with this. So we were talking about what it's like to be in the performing arts, and you mentioned that, and I know this as a participant, that there's a lot of superstition, and there's a lot of spirituality that takes place around live performing art as well, correct?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah.
And for you yourself, you have a bit of a story. So we're going to go back in time a little bit and segue to you. You shared with me in that conversation also about what it was like for you to grow up in a very controlling kind of religious setting, right?
Very. Yeah.
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 Yeah. Tell us
So
a little bit about
you want
that.
me to tell you that now?
Yeah.
I grew up in rural North Florida, and I guess you would call it now DeSantis country, right?
Okay.
Uh, so very a lot of primitive Baptist church. We were Southern Baptist, so it wasn't primitive
Mm-hmm.
Baptist church. There was a lot of fire and brimstone. There was a lot of scary fire and brimstone. I heard racist jokes from the pulpit.
Okay.
Um, and um, and as a maturing boy or young teen, knowing that you're gay, you're told every day you're going to hell, you're an abomination. So so that's the world that I grew up in. Now my
Mm.
father became a pastor. Right? He was not the one with the racist jokes, but my father became a pastor, and I played the piano in his church when I was 8 years old.
Wow.
So I was an 8-year-old. I was a congregational pianist at 8 years old, which is kind of hilarious to think about this
Mm.
8-year-old. sitting there playing for these people.
Were
Yeah, so
you or
that's
are you a prodigy? I mean, were you
I
like
don't
something
think
we
so.
see in a movie
No,
where somebody sits down there and okay.
I wasn't that good. Look, I could play the hymns, but I wasn't one of
Okay.
these people that could, uh, you know, just like massacre the keys. But I could play hymns.
Oh, well, you
I
are
could
at
read
8 years
sheet
old.
music.
Wow.
Yeah, but at eight
Wow.
years old, I guess it kind of seemed like an
That's
8-year-old
pretty
can play
impressive. An
hymns.
8-year-old
But
who, if you could play hymns, not just by ear, but also read sheet music at that age,
I
that's
guess
not
so.
exactly
Now
easy.
that I
Yeah.
hear it that way,
Yeah. Right.
yeah.
That's pretty impressive.
And
Yeah.
yeah, and then I went to a very strict Baptist college in Birmingham, Alabama, where they were famous because dancing was not allowed on campus. So that's how you're, you're upholding that very strict dogma, right? Yeah.
Okay.
Um.
Were you, what
So
was your major at this school?
I well, I was always going to be pre-law. So I'm also a lawyer. So we haven't told that story, right? So
True. We
I'm
have
also
not
a
talked
lawyer.
about that part. Okay.
Yeah, yeah. And so people who listen to the podcast know that, and it's very much a part of the story of seasons 1 and 2, and my
Okay.
role as a lawyer in that story and investigating what happened to me.
Yeah.
No, my major was pre-law, so I was a history major and international relations uh,
Mhm.
major. So that's typical sort of pre-law stuff. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
So theater, was that anywhere in play at this point?
I Yes, I did theater, and then when I was in law school, I did theater after my first semester, and my grades went up. So,
Okay.
and then I got my actor's equity, my union card, during while I was a lawyer in Dallas, Texas.
Wow.
Um, but it was really, I think, going to law school that required me to engage in critical thinking,
Mhm.
you know, and start to question the way I was raised, the values I had, which were very instrumental to me becoming who I am today. But I also had an opportunity to study overseas a semester while I was in college in London. And so at 19 years old, to get out of this small town in the deep south, that really opened my eyes to art and history and cultures and things like that.
And so, how was your faith, knowing that you grew up in a Southern Baptist environment? You have a father who's a pastor. Where's your faith in all of this?
Where is it today?
No, where was it then? How was that journey, especially in those formative years,
Yeah.
coming out of grade school, high school, into college, law school, all of this, and how was it? What was going on there?
Well, look, I think my faith basically stood intact. It was when I came out that I had to really grapple with it,
Okay.
and I had to really shift the way I thought about religion and
Yeah.
spirituality because it didn't conform with what the person I knew that I was. It didn't conform with what I had been taught, not just taught, beaten into me, you know.
Mm. Yeah.
Um, and that's scary. It's scary enough to come out, but then can you imagine
Mhm.
then what are you left with, right? And so I think moving to New York, which was shortly after that time, was really helpful because I found my community. I found more people who thought like me, who had values like me. Ironically, even though we're this huge melting pot in New York City,
Mhm.
you know, so I can't underestimate, you know, the value of New York City becoming my home. Um, helping me with all that.
Hmm. So, did you have a faith practice when you came to the city, or was that kind of off on the shelf?
It was off on the shelf. I think I
Yeah.
tried, at various times to, you know, try some different denominations,
Mhm.
um, and didn't really land. I mean, at this point in my life where I am, I mean, it's such a cliche. I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual, right?
Sure. An
Um,
SBNR. Yep.
yeah. Um, and where I feel closest to some sort of spirituality is either when I'm in nature or when
Mm.
I'm at the Cathedral St. John the Divine, which is in my neighborhood.
And that's where I personally worship as well. So there you are. Yeah.
Well, that feeling in there,
Yeah.
it's just, this makes me emotional. The practices and the teachings and what you hear in that church, in that cathedral, is what is the way the world should be. It's caring for it's community and your fellow man and social justice.
It is, and it's carried all the way through. So I'll share something with you and with our listeners as well. So if you were attending any of the services in the last 5-7 years there, and you happen to see Dean Daniels, he's no longer there; he's retired, but he would always say this, and this was one of my favorite things. He would always, at every time he was presiding over a service, he would say, "Everyone has the right to say, I am loved, I am safe, I am home." That is why I choose that as my spiritual home, because everything that he said and what is carried on today is truly embodied inside of that space. I didn't know that you had a connection to St. John, so we can share in that. And it is that magnificence of the space. I will say that what attracted me was I was at a very low point in my life, and I was a very angry atheist. And yet I wanted to explore something. And so I went to St. John simply because I knew or found out that it was one of the world's largest churches. And I thought, well, okay, that sounds interesting. So I saw it, and it was the magnificence of the space, just that sheer volume of almost being swallowed up in it, that it gave me the space to actually start my own healing process as an angry atheist.
Yeah.
And there's more to my story about that, but agreed. It's probably not everybody's cup of tea from the size. It could be overwhelming to some, and to see everything, but it is a magnificent space. So I'm glad that you find peace inside that as well.
Well, the interesting thing about St. John is my favorite service is Evensong.
Yeah.
And you go because it is a small congregation, and
It
you
is.
sit in that beautiful choir just as a worshiper. It's like where the Queen sits when they had their royal weddings, like at Westminster, right?
Yes,
It's like,
that's where you're sitting.
I've seen the Queen violin, and it's like and it's just this, it's an intimate congregation in this huge, vast space. And then some people choose to sit, out in the nave. It's it's a magical experience being there. And exquisite. That the choir is exquisite, but there's something that happens with that very small congregation during that service that it gives you the feeling is that this is the way the world should be. I can't think of another way to describe it, but that's what I always come away with.
Thank you for sharing that, Sean. That's a happy serendipitous moment of this conversation. I agree with you. Evensong is one of those things that's special in that, for our listeners that are not familiar with the Episcopal Church and the liturgical settings, Evensong is not it's not Mass or Eucharist. There's nothing of that. There's not a celebration. There's not really a worship service at all. It's just simply literally called the Evensong, and it's musical, and you don't have to be worried about the words. It's simply the words are encased inside the music itself. So,
and there's a short sermon as well.
Just a very short one.
Yeah,
yes. About that day's reading, but it's not a full or anything else, and it's not. For the people who are familiar with the Episcopal Church being what we are, we in a typical, full worship service that includes the Eucharist, which is taking the bread and wine, everything else like that. That's not a part of an Evensong, so it's a much easier, lighter way to experience it. So wow,
for someone
I love that.
For someone,
yes. For spiritual but not religious, which you obviously are one of many people who say that because they find that their faith systems that they grew up don't work for them anymore. And this is why people leave the church. And, there are people who stay up late at night wondering why. And it's like, well, it doesn't work for them anymore. And we live in, thankfully, we're evolving into a culture where we're not required to be put into a box that says we must be a believer in this certain way. And especially as you were saying, I'm like you, I grew up in where it was just handed down to you, and this is the way it's going to be.
Yeah.
You went one step further with a father who was also a pastor in the church. So being a preacher's kid, you're really going to, I suppose, get it. But the point is, I look at, again, our younger generations and even us who are saying, no, we won't take part of this. But the younger generations are saying, we really won't participate in anything that is any system that has any form of abuse, trauma, or any oppression or marginalization, anything. So it's just like, we're just not going to do this. Or unfortunately, though, there are those folks, especially from the area where you're from. I grew up in Missouri. There are kids that are, in the Gen Z and in the millennial age brackets who are actually inside high control religious settings where they are told exactly how they have to believe and exactly how they have to do everything. They are in a very tight box because it seems like there's a very either or. There's not a both and anymore in this kind of circumstance. And the Episcopal Church is a good example of that. Like you worship how you want to. Like it's welcome and open to all. And so I'm going to circle back to like your evolution. You explain where you are today. And then, I'm going to ask what I was saying. And the folks that you work with professionally on stage and what you're doing with the podcast, at what point do you think that there will start to be an intersection of this about, abuse and trauma when it goes beyond just mental health? Although, they are connected, but they are from a religious point. Have you considered that? Like, is that an issue at all inside of your craft and in the industry of performing arts? The impact of faith and religion and all of that goes with that. And does that drive anything? Like, I don't know. I'm just asking the question if that's been thought.
Well, it almost comes back to what you were saying is like, what's your calling?
Yeah.
I feel like, Facebook does this thing, mostly on Instagram, and our Stage Combat, the podcast is on Instagram, but Facebook does a thing where it shows you a picture and then it invites you to put something now. Have you seen this? So there's two pictures side by side. Yeah. And so this past week it came up and it said, it showed a picture of me. I was playing Lancelot in Camelot in 2011. So 13 years ago, which was a great experience. And it invited me to put now. And so I put up a picture. We had a promo from the podcast for Stage Combat. It was one of these great pictures my photographer did where I'm just looking off to the side and literally looking at me 13 years ago. And it was then and now. That's a big change in 13 years.
It is. It is.
So I think there's, I've also had to take my own, we said this was a mental health journey and my exploration on mindfulness. Our next episode is about my own personal journey on mindfulness. So it's all related, it's all related in terms of, if you're calling out the harmful practices, it's your values. It's how do you care about your fellow workers, no matter what profession they're in? How do you care about the way you treat people? If it's our mental health, how do you care about you? How do we value our own well-being? How do we invest in ourselves so that we can invest in other people? And then, the whole mindfulness thing too is, I've tried to provide thought leadership on, how companies can better support their mental health and also theater programs. These young adults who are at the infancy of their careers, if we can get them right there before they go out into the real world. So to me, it is all connected, which is interesting because it just kind of came out of me just telling my story of this is what happened to me, and I'm going to tell it like a true crime podcast.
Right. Well, it's a great format in which to do it, and it engages and applies creativity to it as well, which is is one of your great skills.
Yeah. I mean, look, we're all trying. Yeah. We're all trying to figure it out, and I'm very open with the listeners. This is where I am right now. This is what I learned. This is what I learned last week. And never purporting to have it figured out. But I'm thankful for I hate to use the word journey, but it has been an epic journey for me.
Mhm.
It's not where I thought I would be, in my middle-aged years,
Mm.
but dang, I can really, I can welcome it.
Mm.
I don't think we stay one thing all of our lives.
We don't, do we?
Yeah.
Whether we're aware or not, we are still always evolving. And some might say devolve, but, I look at it as the affirmative that, we're always evolving into something. And each day brings a new opportunity for us in whatever little way or great way. There's always those moments where we have something that's transformative, like the night that you had the collapse
Yeah.
on the stage. Look what that did to you. And you say you don't like the word
Well,
journey, and I get you there, but I will say to you, Sean, that certainly puts you on a journey that evening, right? Look where
it
you
is. Well,
are.
that's just me
Yeah.
falling into,
Yeah.
that cliche
I don't want to
criticism.
call it a journey, but it is.
It is. It's like, it's a cliche, but it's true. But
Right.
yeah,
It's all good.
it's, yeah,
Mm.
I absolutely agree with you. Um,
Mm.
yeah, the older we get, right, we realize the only thing constant is change, right? And it's
Yeah.
those that refuse to embrace the change. I would say the people in my industry that don't realize the tide is turning. You're going to be left behind. You know, we can say that about a lot of things going on right now, everywhere.
So we can, couldn't we?
Right.
Given the
But
date in which we are recording this conversation
yeah, the
in
day we're
August of
recording this.
2024.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's so true. So Sean, I have to tell you, I've learned so much about what you're doing with the podcast, and it's so much more than what I thought. It is, you clearly have your heart out there with this uh, noble, might be a cliche word, but there is obviously a reason. It is your call to do this, and it sounds like you're just getting started with this. And so yes,
Oh,
to
yeah.
address to Drew, I mean, like, you're calling out abuse and trauma like what I am through Divine all along. So we're
Yeah.
definitely kindred spirits. We're doing it in a parallel way while there is also intersectionality. And so, yes, when you
Yeah.
talk about the mindfulness and those other elements, because I can't help but believe some of the mental health issues that folks have is a result of what happened to them as a kid in their formative years, right? And like you were saying, same thing happened to me. Thankfully, it wasn't my parents, it wasn't my pastor. I don't have any individual to blame hearing the horrible words, but I was figuring out, okay, I'm queer, and like a couple of other things that really set me off in my psyche, and I
Mm-hmm.
had to find ways of which to cope that got me through the overwhelming majority of my life, only out of pure necessity, to which I look back and I'm grateful. And it's kind of messed up to say that, but if it wasn't for my alcoholism and some other substance abuses, they kept me alive in a
Yeah.
bizarre way, because most assuredly I would have killed myself otherwise, because I just couldn't deal with the pain of who I was. And so, and I say this all to say that this is while I'm still successful in a career, right? I still was making money. I still had, incredibly, successful positions, and was doing my thing and everything else like that. But yet there was the shell of me. And I can't
Mm-hmm.
help but believe that in the creative fields, that's another way, because wouldn't creative arts be a one way of which coping with the religious abuse and trauma? And so you escape, like, you find a way. For me, mine was
Yes.
alcohol and a whole bunch of other shit, but
Yeah.
I could see how like literally leaving this traumatic
Yeah.
world and and transporting yourself through what you do through acting.
It's so funny you mentioned that, because there are two recent interviews that I did with uh, men around my age or younger that acknowledged that they went into the theater for as a refuge for being queer, for being gay,
Yeah.
when their church said they couldn't, or they were bullied taking ballet lessons,
Of
and
course.
the disillusionment that both of these stories felt, that when what has always been your safe place, your refuge, becomes not a safe place, either through harmful practices, or we did a whole episode about actors, why they bully other actors, and what produces that kind of behavior. So, yeah, that's interesting. You should say that, because that's something that specifically has come up. in a couple of these stories. Much like, you looking for a safe place.
Well, yeah, mine was was not the best safe way to do it, but it got me
Yeah,
here to where I can look on the other side, and to which I am very fortunate. I do believe mine is through grace. So we can have a debate and have a conversation about what I define as grace. It could be just a simple coincidence of
yeah,
like waking up one morning is like I literally can't do this anymore, but I call it grace. And I love the fact that though that you're starting to connect the dots for these people who can actually be re-traumatized from
yeah,
something that's happened. And it doesn't obviously, there's going to be a whole host of reasons that people drive that get involved with the performing arts. But that's such great work. So what's next after season 3? Where do you go from here?
Well, what we also did with season 3 is we created Stage Combat at Patreon. Most people are familiar with Patreon.
Yeah.
It's membership based where you can get exclusive content. So the idea was,
Okay.
what we heard from our listeners was they really wanted a sense of community. So we created a Patreon where not only do we have like bonus materials from, the episode you just heard, and I do the post-show wrap up, but we created a companion series. So we have an acting podcast called Just Acting. Like, we looked and there aren't any, which is boggles the mind. So it's fascinating for even people who just want to hear about acting. And then we
Yeah.
have a dedicated mental health podcast where we talk about issues like I was just mentioning. Why do actors bully each other?
Yeah.
Um, uh, you know, oversensitive persons, if you've ever been called too sensitive, what is that? How is that weaponized? Things like that. So
Mm.
that's been a massive undertaking. And so the challenge with Stage Combat going forward is, can we build that community so it's financially sustainable, so that we can keep producing, this meaningful ad-free content, but also how do we get into the academic programs? How do we make the changes within the actors union? How do we start effectuating real change by elevating the conversation? Because part of the challenge we have, Mark, is that the normal theater press that you go to, they don't want to talk about the issues because there's financial incentives to not disturb their revenue dollars. So we have to work
There's that.
around that through social media awareness, because people do want to talk about this. So,
Mm.
every chance we have when we can elevate the conversation, bring it to someone like you who hasn't really thought about it, nor would
Mm.
you, what really goes on backstage.
Mm.
That's valuable work when we can do that.
Absolutely. So for our listeners listening, where do they go to find out more?
Sure. Well, if you want to listen to Stage Combat, the podcast, we're on every podcast platform, Apple, Spotify, wherever. Just type in Stage Combat, the podcast. If you want to check out our Patreon content, that's patreon.com/Stage Combat, the podcast. Most people, Mark, stay connected with us on Instagram. That's Stage Combat, the podcast IG. And it's really a platform for artists to kind of come forward and talk about their experiences. So it really has become sort of this community based content. We feature celebrity stories about trauma they've experienced on series or films or Broadway shows. So it's great content.
That's awesome. Sean, I'm so grateful that you joined us for an episode of Divine and Diverse, and sharing what you're doing, your a passion that you have, this call, and a little bit more about yourself as well. I'm really grateful that to bump into you, and I look forward to seeing us intersect again more in the future. So, Sean, thank you again.
Thank you so much, Mark. I enjoyed our chat.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of Divine and Diverse, a production of Divine All Along Foundation. Please support our good work by going to our website at divineallalong.org and clicking on the donate button. Donation levels start at just $10 a month. Thank you for doing your part in ending religious abuse for our queer family. This is Divine and Diverse.